perhaps more, living and working in England today, in Great Britain today. And of course the trend is in that direction. But I don't think that people who deal with citizenship policies have yet thought about the long-term implication of this population, which perhaps also, unlike traditional diasporas, may be toing and froing between the country of origin and the country of present residence. And of course, both countries being in the EU also changes the given of the situation. I suspect that the present immigration will eventually reinforce the trend towards dual acceptance of dual citizenship. But as far as I know, there's not consideration for voting rights for these expatriates. The last point regarding migration, these new EU states, immigration states, is the other side of the migration medal. For the first time, these states are receiving immigrants, because even though they are poor, there are even poorer states to the east, from which people flock for economic reasons generally to the new EU member states. And for the first time also, these new EU states are receiving non-European immigrants, in other words, visible minorities, as we would call them elsewhere. This, I think, is absolutely revolutionary, because in contrast to the old EU states, Western Europe, which has such heavy colonial traditions, there is no historical contact between the new EU states and Asians or Africans. That means that there is no post-colonial guilt or sense of responsibility. There is no burden of history, but there is also no history of coexistence. In short, there are no ties between these non-European immigrants and the post-communist new EU states. I understand that at present, these immigrants are living in ghettos, more or less, the Chinese in Budapest or the Vietnamese in Poland. But I think they're becoming a permanent feature of the landscape, and the question of their naturalization and integration is one which can be put off for very much longer. I think it would be extremely interesting and pertinent to our concerns to see whether citizenship laws in these countries are broadened or narrowed to take account of this new population. I'll conclude with this and simply recall the points I have made. Fragile states, states that would like to be homogeneous, states which are migration states but now find themselves on the other end of migration. And I'll leave the floor to discussion and to your corrections.
Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you very much. The floor is now open for comments and questions in respect of both of these papers, or indeed points that people want to bring up before, I guess. We've got a number of questions here, so I'll take a couple and then we'll get back to you. Yeah.
Okay. If I can just have a few comments and one question to Andre's paper. I very much like your list of traits characterizing Eastern European states. The question in my mind is, to what extent, except for the small size of these states, to what extent are these traits also traits that have characterized Germany throughout most of its 20th century history? So you investigate the fact that these states are recreating states. Well, so is Germany. You listed that these states have discontinuous traditions. Well, so does Germany. You said these states have had fundamental changes in their territory. Well, so does Germany. And the reason I'm sort of raising this as a question is because in the other presentation here, not to say, but I think there was also reference earlier to the fact of how the Brubaker thesis no longer seems to hold. That is, that states have certain deep, long traditions according to which they develop their citizenship policies. The question is if there are so major structural changes in the geopolitical situation, isn't it conceivable that the long historical traditions will also, in a sense, change and there will be a departure from those traditions because of the big changes in the geopolitical structure?
Lisa?
It's a question for your paper as well. I was wondering whether these the Eastern European states, when you say they still have not yet reacted very much to these physical minorities, but they are growing. I was wondering if there was some kind of exchange of these topics and policies. Because there are so many immigrant communities, maybe living in European countries where these discussions are very present, is there some kind of discussion going on, or influence, or maybe some kind of maybe imitation in a way?
One last one.
Constantine.
Yeah, I want to follow the discussion on the point that Maria raised, which is the dichotomy between what appears to be here Western Europe on the one hand and Eastern Europe on the other. We started with this critique of Roger Brubaker, the fact that there are not unified traditional citizenship, inclusive versus exclusive or civic versus ethnic. We have to be careful not to fall into another trap, that is East versus West, or in other words, to verify geography to analytical types. I've seen the first paper use the word Western Europe, but it's more Europe of the 15 countries and not Western Europe as such. Because, of course, Greece was there, Finland was there, so probably it's better not to say Western Europe, but Europe of 15 countries. And the second paper used Europe, the 12 new states. Again, you refrain from using the term Eastern Europe. But then the categories that you use, in a way, try to create, I would say, an artificial generalization. Well, for example, fragile states, well, fragile on what ground? Is Belgium more, stronger state than Bulgaria? Smallness. We gave the example of Poland. Well, Romania is also a large country. There are more other countries that are smaller in Western Europe. So again, it seems to me that we verify geography to analytical type. Again, I don't want to go against the conclusion. It's very difficult to generalize. I think what is very good for this project that it's a European project. We take a pan-European view, and I think one of the starting points is to renounce categories of Eastern Europe and Western Europe as normative categories. I think these are categories of the code work. And again, I'm not accusing you of using that. I suppose that you refrain from using that. But I think it's better to make it explicit as a critique, as a foundation of our endeavor here.
Just very briefly on the question raised by Lisa. I don't want to preempt Andre's answer, but I've recently been on a dissertation committee for a dissertation written at Bremen University by Alexandra Wierosumska. She now has a different name, but I've forgotten what her new name is. Anyway,
Dr. Alexandra.
She's changed her surname. She got married. It's a question of surnames again. Anyway, she studied Poland and Hungary specifically and looked into citizenship reforms and changes and did interviews with parliamentarians and studied parliamentary documents to see whether these countries are referring to each other. And what she found, unsurprisingly, is they're referring to Western European countries specifically very much in their debates. They're not referring to each other. And the Western European countries never ever refer to the Central Eastern European ones. That's the basic point.
Andre, come back on some of those points.
Yes, thank you for these questions. Yes, the first about Germany. Well, Hans Kohn, who is the father of the civic ethnic Western Eastern distinction, counted Germany as an ethnic Eastern country, and when he was writing in 1944, but once Germany joined NATO, it became a Western civic country. So this both suggests that the categories are malleable, but also that Germany is a very particular country. I mean, it's in the middle quite literally, and it does float, I think, between two traditions. It does, though, have the advantage of size and power, which perhaps compensates for the historical discontinuities and other characteristics of the new EU countries. With respect to migrants, I've been interested that all I found on Vietnamese in Poland or Chinese in Hungary or in Slovakia is ethnographic literature, sort of, how interesting that they should be here, type of thing. I understand that there's a school in Hungary now for Chinese kids, but they're for the kids of executives of Chinese companies, not for the local immigrant community. To my knowledge, there hasn't been citizenship talk about this, but there are people here who know the situation on the ground better than I do. I'd be very interested to hear from them. With respect to Konstantin's point about not sort of centralizing East and West and not drawing a deep division, you're absolutely right that there are countries in the West which are Eastern. Ireland, for instance. Ireland shouldn't be where it is. I mean, it should be somewhere on the Russian border, shouldn't it? And countries which consider Western, like Austria, are also very, very recent. So is Finland, for that matter, as a state. But I am impressed, by the deep-seated differences which have been written about by economic historians, say Andrzej Janusz, who has written very interesting studies of economic development, where there is a real sort of gradation from west to east. And I think that the period of common extermination, whether it lasted about 60 years, more or less, did leave a mark, particularly on this aspect of it. First of all, it closed off these countries to emigration and immigration. It created a particular citizenship culture, which these countries are not trying to overcome. So I think there is cause to have two papers, Martin's and mine, rather than one paper which would talk pen-led about both of them.
Okay. Sorry, yes, I've already got on my list, Sarah. But then if you want to catch my eye, then I'll put you on the list.
Sorry. I had a follow-up. Right, okay. I had a follow-up question to Brian's and Lisa's question also. Are the EU 12 states looking to the common basic principles on integration? Is that serving as a source for new policies? Because when you sort of said, Ireland looks like the East, well, I sort of was hearing that story about the schools and sort of the ad hoc integration approaches that we're seeing in Spain or we're seeing in Ireland. It's kind of similar to the story you're telling, and I don't admit to knowing anything really about the EU 12, but that, Mark makes the point how, the liberalization theory by Randall Hansen and Patrick Bay, well, what's overlooked is that they distinguish Southern Europe as this different experience. And I'm wondering if there's an underlying explanatory or timing issue here about how long you're in Europe and whether there are these forces at play, Europe as a source for these new integration strategies.
Okay. Gentleman over there, I'm afraid I don't know your name. It's fine.
My question is also related to this notion of fragile state, which we use a lot, and I find it extremely problematic. I think most states are fragile. But I think that having a distinction between strong and weak states is something we really need to kind of think behind and think beyond. Perhaps it should be more fruitful to think of some notions of bureaucratic authoritarianism, which are very much embedded in the kind of new social, in the new nation formation processes in these countries. And I think that this will also explain, for example, how it is possible that countries have a very close and exclusive approach to citizenship, have very general rules when it comes to acquiring, because after all, this is left to the discretion of the bureaucratic authorities and decide the way they like. So in this sense, you can have a way of thinking about why it's related to this. And something that relates to the previous debate about the use of the term of republicanism, which I think is very problematic. I mean, the UK, the most, swearing allegiance to the crown is an anti-republican practice, but it is cited as an example of republicanism. So it's something that we need to be very, very careful on how we use this. And I think that what is very, very relevant to debate at this point is that beneath these debates around citizenship, who belongs and who doesn't belong, there's a creeping racism involved. And I think that we need to find the analytical category which doesn't sound as political as I have described, but essentially that's what it is. There is an innate core of a nationalist perspective on how the nation state should be constructed, which is essentially racist. And I think that that's something that has to be built in our analytical categories of how we define things. It doesn't sound nice because it doesn't sound contrary to the idea of the building economy in Europe, but I think it's something that we really need to address somehow in our analytical categories of citizenship.
Thank you. It's a shame that Cyprus is missed off this map, isn't it?
Yes.
Ricky?
Yes. I don't really have a question, but more a comment, and probably it adds a little bit to what you just said. We'll probably get to discuss it tomorrow as well. Just adding on what the friends Martin mentioned, the introduction of integration tests, which is an obvious trend in various all the new member states. I think it's very important when updating or writing or whatever in country reports to do it in a certain level of detail when writing a comparison. It will become very apparent what the actual differences in the different integration tests are, because there are integration tests in various countries, but the level of these integration tests, whether language tests or society knowledge tests, differs greatly between various member states. For example, in Denmark, the level of language you have to know is very high. It's level B1, which is, well, you have to know quite a lot and be able to write, longer pieces and stuff, things like that. Whereas, for example, in the UK, if you're not able to do the citizenship test, you can also participate in a language course, which can be at a very, very basic level. So, which could mean that in the UK, less educated people are less excluded than, for example, in Denmark. I think that's a very important aspect at which should be paid attention. Also, the ground for exemption for the tests. In the Netherlands, for example, people with a certain education are exempt, whereas people who voluntarily took part in integration courses are not. So this could also be certain, point to a certain form of discrimination. And also the cost for the tests, do they need to be paid by the immigrants themselves, or are there forms of state support? And all these things added together could provide a more accurate picture of the actual implications of the integration conditions.
I'll take one more question and then we'll get back to the legal.
That's right.
Does it work?
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on federalism. That's interesting what Andrea mentioned. Definitely about disastrous experience of federalism or not. Well, what triumphed in Eastern Europe was obviously nation state and the concept of nation state. You mentioned that in Western Europe we have trend towards federalization that I can only observe in the countries that are not republican, that are actually monarchies, which is Spain, Great Britain, and Belgium. So wherever you have more or less republican conception of state, there's no federalism. There's no federalism in France, and there's regionalization, but I wouldn't talk about federalism. So definitely the wide unitary concept, and so what we witnessed in Eastern Europe, that all these federations disintegrated more or less according to the former republics. Kosovo is a huge exception, obviously, because it was not a republic, it was an autonomous province. And there was an underlying principle of this disintegration, which was to recognize former republics that were themselves based more or less on ethno-national criteria, were more or less nation states. So it's hard to say also that Slovenia is only 20 years old. We could say that politically Slovenia is more than that. It was established really as a state with prerogatives of the state we did in Yugoslavia in 45. So it will be interesting to observe how under socialism these republics were exercising their own state. So yes, more or less common.
Okay. I must apologize, Martin, I got confused. I was thinking that Ryan was given the paper, and I can give you a chance before we all take a chance. Remember, Ryan just asked the floor again, and then I'll come to you. You can have a good go at it. Sorry, Martin.
Very briefly on the two questions that were raised. One, I would like to pass on the question whether the common basic principles on integration are respected in the EU 12 member states. I would love to hear an answer to that question from Julia Henry, who's from the European Fund on the Integration of Third-Country Nationals. So welcome also to Julia on this occasion. Secondly, on Nico's question about whether we should use the term republicanism in characterizing a regime like the British one, I use it provocatively because it comes as a big surprise. Looking at the post-colonial, pragmatic, common law tradition of Britain, and then suddenly finding these ideologies of civic republicanism emerging in that very unlikely context. That somehow sets the bells ringing. It means it could be a trend set that if it can happen even in Britain, then it might be possible in a number of other countries that have a stronger domestic tradition of republicanism in their own histories. And finally, just one point that I feel is important to initiate now that we're discussing the new member states to introduce that. When we dealt with the NATO project, there was something that we didn't take into account, and this was exactly the impact of changing borders of the creation of new states on what we're studying. In most citizenship countries, we take states as stable backgrounds. So we're dealing only with how individuals acquire or lose citizenship and assume that the citizenship and the state is given. This is why we only talk about birthright acquisition and some forms of naturalization afterwards. But of course, in the new member states, you have the problem of what we now call initial determination of citizenship when the borders change, or when the state becomes independent. And there are distinct modes of initial determination of citizenship that need also to be studied comparatively. So maybe we have to include them in the comparative framework when we deal with these countries. The original contribution was already made again by Ubeck in the early 1990s when they talked about including the post-Soviet states, and basically what we find is a threefold distinction. There are three rules. One is the so-called zero solution, which means everybody who is a legal resident at the point of independence becomes automatically a citizen. The second rule is the restoration of citizenship rule applied in the Baltic states. You go back to a previous time of independence, and then those people who were citizens then and their descendants are the only ones that are automatically included, and the others have to apply for naturalization. And the third rule is the federal breakup principle, where suddenly a sub-state level of republican citizenship in the Czechoslovak case or the Yugoslav case that was pretty unimportant in the Czechoslovak case, at least, pretty much a formal thing, suddenly becomes important because it becomes the reference point. Only if you were registered as a Republican citizen before independence are you automatically then a citizen of the independent republic. These are the three basic principles, but then again, we have to look at it in exactly the same level of detail that we use for the other modes of acquisition and loss, and see what the conditions are attached, the bureaucratic procedures of including or excluding certain populations under each of the tools.
Martin must get his say now, because he's been deprived.
Yeah, well, just some brief comments on that. Of course, the mapping fact is very useful in this case. We can see indeed Europe, East and West and South, and I think that would also be one of the ideas of the project, to go beyond the East-West distinction. I think we should definitely not use them as analytical categories. At the same time, of course, we sometimes see similar patterns in geographical regions, right? If you think of these integration conditions, this has been introduced as a northwestern phenomenon, I guess, right? And there are a couple of similar characteristics where we can probably say that Italy and Greece and Spain perhaps are to some extent also similar, but we see low naturalization rights, maybe relatively high discretion for the administration. And so sometimes you may see some similar patterns, but that doesn't mean necessarily that these geographical notions should also be used as analytical categories, which is why I think it's very good to bring all these countries into one project to speak of one Europe, but then of course to think eventually comparatively about what are the important analytical aspects of countries that we want to use to explain some of the differences, right? So we have emigration countries in East and West. We have also some, of course, countries with problematic borders. We have different traditions, so in that case, I think that would in fact be the challenge, and of course the interesting question tomorrow in the comparative presentation would be to see to what extent René and I will present the NECA analytical grid in a little bit of detail. To what extent can we use this grid indeed also to apply to the new countries? Right? And well, I think this will be very good to get feedback and to see how far we can get, right? And of course, in that sense, the grid should be generalizable to cover this diversified group of countries. And the only problem I would see indeed is maybe the starting point, right? If there would be a specific, say, post-communist versions of where to start in a new democracy, but once the starting point is, so it may be the case that we need to introduce a specific mode for that, which we can only use in the East and not in the West. But once we have covered that starting point, my idea would be that we can get relatively far. But to make this point, of course, it's completely true that we should always be as detailed as possible, right? And in that sense, even if you see these different integration conditions, we need to take this to look a little bit in the detail, I think, which is exactly what we want to do. I don't know, René, if you want to add something to that?
Yeah, René had asked for the floor.
Yeah, only very briefly. If you would like to pay attention to this initial determination, and one of the options mentioned by Anna was the federal breakdown, we should realize that we have this problem of the federal breakdown in Western Europe as well. But in the colonial setting, because in the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, Belgium, and France had to deal with precisely this. And then one gets as well how people from colonies get access to the nationality. How was this breakdown precisely?
So, listen to me.
No. I know in part how it went, but I only want to draw the attention on the fact that that part of the nationality history is comparable with the situation in Eastern Europe. Of course, in a different political context, but the nationality questions which have to be answered are partly the same. At least it's a construction.
Well, I'd have to definitely reflect a long time before I say anything like that. Do you want, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Andre, and then, yeah. You wanted to say?
Well, bring up a little bit just to follow up of what Ryan said me to ask, but I will maybe elaborate further discuss with Sarah, because it's a complex issue how the complex principles are implemented and not only in new member states. I had planned to hide my reply in the version of the forced to. I will try to give an answer. The difficult thing is that we are now really beginning annual reports on some information, because the aim of the annual reports on integration that the Commission issues is really to monitor, evaluate, maybe it's a strong term, but to follow the implementation of normative principles on integration in all EU member states. But as the developments in this field, especially I would say in new EU member states, are so rapid and fast, that this instrument became really, I don't want to say useless, but really not up to date. So we will discuss also by after we are really rethinking this instrument to assess the implementation of common basic principles. What I can say is that common basic principles formally are really a reference in many new EU legislations with respect to integration. So they're really mentioned as a reference, which is already something. And also, really just if I want to be brief, a good lens to see how this will be taken on board, I think, is the use of the European Integration Fund resources. Member states will have, in order to use these financial resources, have to put in place actions which, that's the first priority of the fund, put in practice common basic principles. So that's a good instrument to look how, especially new EU member states will do. It's interesting in reading the national programs implementing the fund. It's interesting to read this annex to the annual report, but of course, as it was underlined today, the interest, the attention of specific aspects on integration of EU member states is extremely recent. So it's something that it's coming up, but maybe for sure not really consolidated. So just to answer to the rest of this.
Thank you, Julia. Andre.
Thank you, Joe. To reply to two of the questions which were raised, Nikos, fragile states. Yes, of course, who would have thought that the Soviet Union was a fragile state, and yet it disappeared, didn't it? So perhaps we're all fragile at some point. But I was thinking of the essay by István Vigo, which I cited before in this context, which is translated into French as La misère, where he talks about the haunting fear that our nation may disappear. There may be no more one day Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, perhaps even Hungarians, or even the Polish national anthem sort of sings, whistling in the dark, Poland is not yet lost. Well, that's not the sort of fears that some other nations have. I think the French, even at the worst moments, never thought that they would no longer be France. And they may not be in Great Britain, but they will always be in England, as they say. So I think that's what I meant about fragility. I won't address authoritarianism, because I think that's a very difficult issue. But the question of racism, what sort of surprising, just as what strikes me, just on an impressionistic level, is not that there's a racism in the new EU countries, but there is a sort of inability to imagine that someone who is not like us, who looks like us, could be our fellow citizen. I mean, can one imagine a Chinese Pole? Well, yes, one could, but I think for most Poles it's very difficult to imagine that. Whereas, of course, in the old EU countries, because of colonial factors and Islamization and so on, this is something which is not unusual, right? The question about federalism, which was raised later on, well, I think it's a very interesting thesis that you have to be a monarchy to be a federalist. But in fact, there are republican federal states. Austria, the German Federal Republic, both are. And I would suggest that countries which are not formally federal, but have widespread regionalism, like this country, Italy as well, but even France, of all places, is extending regional autonomy to Corsica and thinking about other areas. But the idea that the secretary that you mentioned, Slovenia, has only really been a state for 20 years, but was a unit within Yugoslavia before. That's, I think, a valid point. It's not being a state. I mean, no one would say that, just we didn't need independence because we were already a state before, clearly. But this is a thesis which has been developed, I think, very persuasively by post-Soviet scholars. I'm thinking of Ronald Sooney and Terry Martin, who say that in fact the communist system, with its pseudo-federalism and so on, in fact created all the bases for national states in spite of themselves. And that's why, when they fell apart, how did they fall apart? They fell apart into the constituent quasi-national units.
I'd just like to say thank you to the two paper givers, and apologise again to Martin for passing over him earlier on, to thank everybody who asked questions and made comments. And I'm going to pass the chair to Rainer, who's going to chair the round table, and I think in order to stay literally round the table, we're just going to do it from the places that people are in, unless they are uncomfortable about that.
So this is the final concluding roundtable for this first day of our conference. We are running exactly on schedule, but the last bit will be difficult in terms of keeping the time, because we have 45 minutes and we have 5 speakers listed for this roundtable. So I'll ask each of them to keep it within 8 minutes. That leaves us 1 minute. It's flexibility in a way. Let me briefly say what the task is. The title that we came up with was what we know, what we already know, and what we want to know. How can the Citizenship Observatory be useful for research and for policy development? So it's a tall agenda, but that also means each of you are pretty free to come up with your own ideas, your own agendas and suggestions. And I think that's the idea. You now can make an intervention that might have an impact on how we further develop the project when we start to go into the planning mode as of tomorrow morning. Let me briefly introduce the 5 speakers. This is Kai Heidbronner from Constance University, who has now joined us, was slightly delayed, stuck at customs control at Florence Airport. Isel Conran from University College Dublin, Maria Kovac from Central European University, Giovanna Zincone, Thierry Turin, and Julia Henry from the European Commission, DG JLS. Shall we take it in this order? Is that all right? So it would be right.
Thank you, Rainer. Very sorry. I had originally the intention to talk a little bit about Germany, because I don't think the description was quite right of Germany shifting from in a middle position between an ethnic state and whatever, but perhaps tomorrow, or we don't have enough time. And I also wanted to talk originally about the succession of state problems, which I do think are in the Eastern European states, particularly the Baltic states, quite different from what we had after the First World War and the last 60 years. But I'll concentrate a little bit on the expectations lawyers have to the numbers and figures and the observatory. I think it's quite clear that we need to know about citizenship laws and numbers in other countries. When I came on the plane from Zurich this morning, I read an article in the debate in Switzerland right now, and one of the arguments against the extension of the bilateral agreements of freedom of movement is that Romania and Bulgaria that do have very liberal sort of citizenship legislation, which would enable Russians, Ukrainians, and whoever coming and make use of the freedom of movement. Now, of course, this is a political argument, but it is quite interesting how even citizenship legislation is used in the political debate on movement, which shows quite clearly that there is a repercussion or that there is a connection with the general migration. Now, from a legal point of view, it is of course important to know the citizenship legislation for the very fact that we need to know how legislation works or doesn't work, and why it works or doesn't work. Citizenship
law is certainly particularly prone to politicization, as shown by example. Therefore, we need to know, if possible, precise figures and numbers of acquisition of nationality and admission of foreign nationals. Now, let me give one example to show how important that is and to what extent it is important to have something like our observatory. We're now, somebody has mentioned, the German legislation on use solely the introduction of a new legislation which enables people to acquire for a certain time dual nationality by birth if one of the parents has a residence right, a secure residence right, and now the people have to opt between 18 and 23 for either German or their foreign nationality. Now, my personal conviction that is, to put it provocatively, that this is more of a symbolic law. It's the outcome of a compromise, but I do not think that a substantial number of people will really lose their dual nationality in the end, because there are a number, of course, there are exceptions in all cases where you would under general naturalization laws, you would have an exception. And there will be a practice, of course, there will be certainly a practice, of course, which would, in the end, let me just say the end, probably, I may be wrong, but in the end, lead to the result that what the legislator has intended to achieve, which means to enforce the principle of avoidance of dual nationality, will not take place, because I think there will be so many exceptions that the exception is the rule, and there will be very few who are in fact losing their nationality. However, I may be wrong, and we will see the observatory, and we will observe how this is observed in practice. Now, somebody has mentioned the federalism, and I think that is particularly important to know something about how citizenship or naturalization laws are applied in federal states. And Germany is a very good example. For a long time, we had even diverse practices, for instance, on naturalization tests. Some states do now have a general naturalization test introduced on the federal level, which, by the way, so far has been not very much of a problem, at least in terms of numbers, because 98% of all people pass a test. So, contrary to a general assumption in political debate that this would be a very high threshold and reduce substantially the number of naturalizations. Now, we certainly need, particularly in the federal system, also more precise figures about procedures. How long? It may be much more important to know how long a procedure is, how difficult it is to get through that procedure. The expenses of that procedure may be much more important than legal rules, at least in practice. So we do not have very many precise figures about that. Obviously, a second purpose of our observatory and our numbers is also to find out trends and to identify trends. Also, in order to find out repercussions. Some of them have been mentioned on the European level, although clearly European citizenship is not within the competence of the European Union. Nevertheless, we observe that there is an intrinsic relationship between integration, migration issues, and citizenship legislation. And I think that will, as you have already mentioned, that will come up in the European context. It does come up already very much so in the national context, but since integration is a national, but also does have some European repercussions, there will be a need for information. I've noted 2 more minutes, and I'm almost through. European identity. I also think it is quite important to know, for instance, somebody also has mentioned the new German law, which I think is quite interesting, but we don't know very much really about the effect and how it works in practice so far. To have an exception, general exception from the rule of avoidance of dual nationality for European, for Union citizens. How that is, to what extent is that considered as important? Does it really play a role? Does it have an effect on general integration issues? And also, apart from the EU context, the general issue, to what extent did our general assumption, which has been sort of a common assumption, that naturalization is an important element of integration, is that really true? Do people who have been naturalized perform much better in a somewhat longer perspective? Do they much better in professional performance, in school achievement, and things like that? I think that will also be quite important. And my final point is, I make it very brief, I think there are also in the future is more need for the international, have an international perspective generally, apart from the European perspective, have an international perspective on nationality legislation and practice. Because there will also be, with the change of citizenship concepts, there will certainly be also a question of loss and withdrawal, and that requires a certain coordination. For an interesting case, but no time to explain that in the European context, where you have a direct repercussion on the legislation of another state. And I think, generally speaking, we will have to think about sort of collecting information about what happens in other member states. For instance, just one example: exercise of political rights of dual nationals. When we're talking about facilitation of dual nationality, we will have to grapple with the problem that it might not be advisable to have people who are at the same time exercising full political rights in two member states. Just as one example. So we need some information about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai, for a great effort to stay within the time limit. It's tough, but not as tough as the European Parliament, 3 minutes. Lisa.
Thank you. I'm new to this arrangement. I wasn't involved in the NATAC project, and I'm really pleased to be involved in this EUCITAC. And I'd like to start from thinking about the value of what I've learned from the NATAC volumes and so far, and the way in which what I gather from some of the participants were regarded as very draconian templates that were sent out to experts did elicit really useful comparative chapters for people who had to grapple with things that might not be seen internally as central to their citizenship regimes, and sort of brought some commonality between the different approaches to citizenship. And that obviously is something that probably we can build on and develop still further. That reading the NATAC volume, reading the chapters, you become aware of dimensions that maybe, as part of the dimension, latent in certain countries, or not systematically there, but potentially there in some kind of way, in a way that would be really interesting. Now, I should say that I'm a political scientist, or more specifically a political theorist, known as a political theorist, as was mentioned earlier. And it is interesting that citizenship is inherently a normative conception. We move very quickly from the idea of being a citizenship to the idea of being a good citizen or not being a good citizen. And therefore, there are all kinds of implications of normative theory for what citizenship is and how we understand it, and vice versa. So we need to think, as I think Martin implied earlier, about what would constitute a liberal approach to citizenship, rather than maybe assuming that certain things constitute a liberal approach to citizenship, or what would constitute a Republican approach to citizenship. Very briefly on that, I could say that, okay, there's a joke involved in the idea of being Republican to swear an oath of loyalty to the Queen, but Joe would have mentioned other things, such as the requirement of civic service, or knowledge of the constitution and history of the country, or even language tests that could be required of all citizens, including native born citizens, to become good citizens, as well as, which could be more fitting with a more kind of, a more conventional notion of what it is to be Republican. So I think it'll be really interesting to see the ways that these things, we might need to think about what counts as liberal and what counts as Republican, because I think some earlier analyses of comparative analyses rely on well, all conceptions of what it is to be liberal and what it is to be Republican are a bit contested, but they rely on maybe particularly contestable notions of what it means to be liberal or to be Republican. Now, what do we need? I'm going to jump ahead maybe a little bit here, and first of all, go pick up some of the themes mentioned by some others and what are in the Attic volume. I think we do need more examination of the complexity of citizenship through birth, as well as through naturalization, which Rainer mentioned that there be more conservational studies on naturalization in the past. And on naturalization, as also mentioned in the dynamic volume, but it's something somebody coming from Ireland I'm particularly aware of, and the need for much greater knowledge of statistics, of procedures, of administrative workings and so on, and the reasons for, grounds for refusal and so forth, even in places where systems look very straightforward on the surface. And that would be something that would be really valuable if through this website and putting what information is available up in the public realm, so other European countries might get shamed into actually providing proper information and statistics on these matters. And also, there's the question in terms of naturalization itself. In relation to Sarah Goodman Wallace's work, not just thinking about the need to not just about conditions of eligibility, but of the level of difficulty of attaining naturalization or citizenship through naturalization, which will again give us a much greater idea of to what extent it is possible for a person to become a citizen or not. I feel like a lot of this will involve looking at the how rather than the what of access to citizenship. I'd like to say a quick word before I jump ahead to tomorrow's session, but I'm not speaking in tomorrow's session, say a little bit about some of the specific tasks that we're going to be involved with in the project, and those are the comparative analysis. At the moment, there are 4 comparative analysis papers planned within the framework of the existing project. And I'm especially interested in one of those, since I'm involved in writing the one on use solely citizenship for second and third generations, which is very complex, can be a very complex matter compared to the simple idea of this solely citizenship, which as citizenship at birth, for as it exists in the United States and exists in Ireland up to 2004. So I'm really looking forward to the dense information that we may get from experts on this. And just to remind you, the other projects are one on naturalization, as already mentioned, and requirements for naturalization, one on external citizenship conditions for loss, obtaining, requiring citizenship, and one on comparative report on trends in citizenship policies in the 10 settlements. These focus on citizenship for immigrants, in minorities, and trends in naturalization, which other people can speak about. So I think it's really going to be very useful to build on what has come out of that. I think everybody can benefit by seeing the commonalities and the commonalities in approach and the elements that were turned up, if you like, by people looking at citizenship through a common grid. I'll just mention 1 or 2 of the things that I have personal interest in more detailed information than I'll stop there and let somebody else find out.
This is extremely generous. I'm not going to cut you off like this, but the next speaker might appreciate this. And the next speaker is Maria.
Thank you very much. I come from the Central European University in Budapest, which already showed the indication of how confused we are. Is this one? We are on the names. So I'm, even though I'm supposed to be talking about the new EU 10, there's no other way I can describe the new EU 10 than to say that I'm talking about new East European member states. Anyway, I'm trying to take the title of the panel seriously and talk a little bit about what we know and what we need to know. What we know about Eastern European citizenship policies, I think we know in great fact for the extremely useful groundwork and stock-taking that has been done in this volume of citizenship policies in Europe. It's a wonderful volume. What it did in terms of comparative studies, it identified several directions for the research of citizenship policies in the region. It identified the common patterns observed throughout the region. Then it went on to identify certain patterns characterizing only certain groups of states in the region. And third, it pointed to areas of potential citizenship conflicts among the new member states. And fourth, it identified specific citizenship conflicts related to the shifting of the external borders of the EU. In those specific cases, the new external borders of the Union create a border between a kin state, such as Hungary or Romania as an example, and an external kin population, such as, let's say, Hungarians in Romania, Serbia, or Ukraine, or Romanians in Moldova. One important process that was identified in this volume was the relative weakening of EUCITAC principles observed in most of the states. In some states, as the successor states of the Soviet Union, this trend was observed in the policies on the initial determination of citizenship, and which led, in some cases, to the appearance of statelessness. And it led also to the setting of prohibitive standards for naturalization in some cases. In other states of the region, the same phenomenon was observed in the appearance of policies of co-ethnic preferentialism for transborder ethnic minorities. And strange as this may sound, this is also contributing to the weakening of EUCITAC principles. The volume also drew attention successfully to the problem of stateless minority groups within new member states, and to the problem of ethnic minorities in the new member states who possess the citizenship of another neighboring state. And here, the primary example is, of course, possessing the citizenship of Russia. But now, I think that as we move on and start working on creating the observatory, our task, at least with regard to the 10 East European new member states, is to begin refining this large regional view and see what sort of new research and analysis we can engage in. I would suggest that, as my first point, that what we can now begin to do is to begin investigating country by country the steps of change, the results of reform over the time that has passed since 1989, and assess the outcomes of these reforms. Second, we can now begin asking questions about the effects of union membership on citizenship policies and the possible appearance of new tendencies that emerge out of the enlargement. Third, we can try to point to those areas in which a possible coordinated European Union effort may contribute to the easing of some existing regional pressures and tensions. And for this, I'd like to bring one example, and that's the example of the problem of Moldova and Romania. Because soon after the war in Georgia, the European Union engaged in a campaign, in some sort of an initiative to try and establish a visa-free regime for Moldova. For for several reasons. The arguments for establishing a visa-free regime for Moldova was one, to make Moldovan citizenship more attractive for Moldovans, including ethnic Russians, but also to ease the pressure on Romania, coming from Romanians in Moldova, to create new European citizens through the instrument of non-resident external citizenship. Just that now we are with Moldova, may I say to Andre that in fact Moldova and Romania are a case when the same language is being used as official language in two countries. The
Moldovans don't think so.
But was that a requirement? We call it Moldovan, but it's really the same language. Anyway,
Let the Moldovans speak.
yeah. And then, as a fourth task, I think that in this new phase of our research and analysis, we need in identifying those areas of domestically contested possible future reforms in which a possible setting or initiative of minimum standards by the EU would possibly have in tilting the balance in this debate towards a more inclusive citizenship in these new member states.
Thanks, we are saving time. Maybe there's even a round of question and answer period here. Our next speaker is Giovanna. Giovanna Ciccone,
I interpreted my role as a member of the round table as a sort of weak bridge between this afternoon section and the section of tomorrow. I don't know if I interpreted correctly. So, and we also have one of the good what we know now, what we need to know, and how can the services be useful. So these are the key questions that we are in a way starting. I've already started to answer this afternoon, but we should answer even better probably tomorrow, because tomorrow we are moving in